think I've switched to you.
Yeah, you have. I have a black
okay,
slide,
good,
and
yeah.
I want to try, I love your yam.
My yam, yeah. Well, yammering is a way of, about talking too much, you know.
No, not at all. But Marey, besides being the inspiration for marvelous work that Bernie does, and that is all around you today, his decomposition of movement was astonishingly influential in a number of other disciplines, and I just want to give you a list so we know what we're talking about. So Marey first succeeded in mechanically graphing the movements within and of the body. That's a good idea. There he is, as a young person. He triggered a revolution in medicine by creating the means to translate all invisible life functions, like the beat of a heart, into a visible and legible form, which I'm going to show you. All the electric graphing machines that you see in hospitals today, like electrocardiographs, encephalographs, oscilloscopes, they all derive from graphing machines that Marey devised more than a century ago. And then, using the same principles as he did with his graphic method, he honed the photographic camera into a scientific instrument to analyze the motion of humans and animals. Then Wilbur Wright, who you might know, suggested that without Marey's study of the flight of birds, he and Orville would have never taken to the air. Whoops, my microphone just went. Okay.
It's still on.
It's still on. So that's aviation. And without Marey, for anybody studying the birth of motion pictures, his work is crucial. It's the source of both the Edison and Lumiere brothers' later inventions. Marey was the first person to use motion pictures as training materials for athletes, but this is only one of a number of important contributions he made to the history of physical education and gymnastics. And finally, the European science of work was founded on his studies of the body at work and the working body. So, born in 1830, Marey trained to be a doctor, but he found the new science of physiology more suited to his taste for pure research and to his talents. He was a mechanical genius. He believed that he could make physiology a more exact science, the equal of physics and chemistry, which were the most advanced sciences of his day, by using machines to measure the functions of the body, to determine the laws that govern them. And at the root of this was a radical perception of the human body, because Marey saw the body as a machine, an animate machine whose workings could be explained by the laws of theoretical mechanics. And more radically, he defined the life which animated this machine as a complex motor which, like inanimate motors, consumed fuel and supplied energy. A motor, in fact, whose functions could be reduced to the newly discovered laws of thermodynamics. And then ultimately, Marey confined himself to one subject only, and that was the body's most manifest form of energy, movement, or as he put it, the language of life itself. But of course, when he started working, it was a language that no one had yet deciphered, and Marey had chosen to explore a domain in which the unaided senses were powerless. So his great achievement was to adapt graphing machines used in physics to record motion within and of the body without recourse to the hand or to the eye. He began by graphing the internal dynamics of the body and then the external kinetics. And at the end of his life, he studied the media through which these moving beings moved, the eddies and the ripples in air and water. And for Marey, the graphing instruments were the intermediaries between mind and matter, which we'll talk about. So let me be specific now. Can you go back to me?
Yes.
And see, will this come on? Right. This is the first instrument Marey constructed. It's a sphygmograph, and it is one of the earliest pulse takers and inscribers. It inscribed the pulse with a stylus on a smoked, blackened box, which you can see there. But the sphygmograph, as you can also see, had to be attached to the wrist, and for the majority of the body's movements, such direct contact was not possible. By 1862, Marey had come up with a method of transmitting movement through the air. He stretched a rubber membrane tightly over a tiny metal drum and connected it by hollow rubber tubing to another attached to a stylus, as Bernie showed us. So any impulse given to the first tambour, as these metal drums were called, was directly transmitted to the second and to the stylus, marking the smoked blackened cylinder. And this method of transmission allowed him to transform the organic world into a mechanical form of writing, both intelligible and permanent. These machines graph circulation, but they also present us with something else that is critical to Marey's thinking. In order to verify the accuracy of what he was analyzing, Marey synthesized his analysis with other mechanical models that he called his schema. Yeah. So
that last image, by the way, was a pantograph mechanism, which I've stolen, in a sense, from Marey, who had stolen it from James Watt and numerous other people before. But there's a pantograph, a pneumatic pantograph a la Marey over in the corner here. Anyway, a little interruption.
Not at all. So here is his polygraph, which measured circulation and respiration, and his myograph, which measured the phases and the speed of muscular contraction. This myograph provided him with the first visible tracings of fatigue. You can see where the line starts to smooth out in the diagram on the right, and also the earliest understanding that fatigue was the limiting factor in the human motor's ability to produce work or to run efficiently. So it seemed imperative to him at this moment that he investigate the more complex acts of movement in order to elaborate the laws governing the conservation of bodily energy. And that's the reason that in the 1870s he turned from graphing the inner dynamics of the body to graphing the phenomena that produce locomotion. Here, the primary difficulty was, of course, maintaining contact with two, or in the case of the horse, 4 moving legs, or birds, 2 wings. But he started with creating special shoes that contained a hollow chamber connected by rubber tubing to the receiving tambour and stylus. And with some variation, the technique also worked for horses. The resulting inscriptions gave the first accurate recording of the horse's paces, and that was the resolution of one of the deepest mysteries of the 19th century. Birds were a little more difficult, but Marey had some success in describing the elliptical path of the wing, enough success to build a model airplane and a model insect and a bird, which is very close to Bernie's belief would be my brother on our left. This, of course, marks the beginning of French aviation. But Marey knew that he needed a machine that would make an optical trace, a picture of the movement. A picture would provide a description of the movements of subjects that couldn't be harnessed to the tambours and rubber tubing, and a picture would give the exterior characteristics of the whole body in its changing dimensions as it moved, and all of the relationships that occurred between one body part and the other simultaneously. And in 1878, just as he was facing this problem, such a pictorial solution was offered in this sequence of photographs of trotting and galloping horses published in La Nature, the French scientific journal. They were taken by Edward Muybridge, an Anglo-American photographer who was hired by the governor of California, Leland Stanford, to photograph his horses, because Stanford had apparently seen Marey's tracings showing how the horse was suspended in the air at a certain point. And Stanford wanted that proven by a photograph, that is, something made by a machine that did not lie. So, inspired by Muybridge, Marey took up photography. After experimenting in 1882 with a photographic gun that made 12 sequential images on a rotating disc, Marey succeeded in decomposing phases of movement on a single fixed plate with a single camera and in real time, and I'm just going to show you how he did that. He dressed a man, and he only worked on men. That was the default body, no women, all in white, and he had that person, that man, move in bright sunlight in front of a black background. He operated on this body with an ordinary camera with its lens left open, and behind the lens he put a rotating metal disc, as you can see here, which had from 1 to 10 slots cut into it at even intervals. Now, as the man moved in front of the black background, he would be in a different location each time a slot in the rotating shutter exposed the glass plate, creating a sequence of images. And the faster the disc shutter rotated, the more images would layer on the same plate, since less time would elapse between the exposures, and the subject, of course, would cover less ground. But Marey's camera was obscuring what he actually wanted to see, which was the clear expression of movement. So, operating on the subject this time rather than the camera, he eliminated the superimposition, first by covering the half of the body in black velvet, as you can see here, and then by covering the whole body in black and marking its joints in white. So now he had pure movement, detached from the performer and conveyed in a graphic form, and of course a photographic image, totally without precedent. And he called his method chronophotography. And chronophotography allowed Marey to finally analyze the mechanics of how we actually walk, run, and jump, and how the animals with whom we share this planet actually move. In the 1890s, chronophotography also enabled him to study the movement of the inorganic, the trajectory of projectiles, the geometric forms engendered by a string or a wire moving around an axis, balls dropping or being thrown, and even water, where there was no bearer or guide. In 1900, he moved into the area of aerodynamics. He constructed a wind tunnel in which he photographed smoke fillets traveling around different shaped planes. The appearance of paper film strips on the market in 1888 yielded the final methodological development of Marey's studies of movement. He substituted a roll of paper film for his glass plate, and he constructed a film feeding mechanism that stopped the film for an instant behind the lens, enough time for an image to be made, and then pulled it onto a roller. These are his earliest films. And one of his most famous, a cat falling, being dropped actually to prove that it always lands on its feet. So it was this camera that Edison borrowed for his kinetoscope, which you see here, and the addition of a better film feeding mechanism allowed the Lumiere brothers to patent their cinematograph and project the first pictures to a paying public in 1895. Marey also changed the way the body was represented in the aesthetic domain. In 1904, after 1904, the year that he died, the experience of the newly industrialized workplace and the new technologies such as telegraph and telephone and automobile, phonograph and cinema had come to foster a heightened awareness of subjective time, a sense that for the individual, time proceeds at an irregular pace beyond the reckoning of any standard and authoritative system of measurement. It's part of this new culture of time, the subjective experience, the core of which we call now, that Marey's imagery was severed from its purely scientific roots and comes to belong to the canon of 20th century art. For artists who followed the Cubist transformation of spatial and temporal conventions after Cubism, Marey's chronophotographs were irresistible. for Franz Kafka, whose Women Picking of Flowers you see here, they resolved his attempts to demonstrate the appearance of motion. For Duchamp, the chronophotographs were seized on as a mechanized alternative to sensible beauty, enabling him to put, as he said, painting at the service of mind. The Italian futurists, this is Boccioni's Elasticity of 1912, sorry, yes, adopted Marey's chronophotography because both scientifically accurate and lyrically graceful, as a ready-made coherent system of science to express the kinetic and emotional dimensions of the subject. Luigi Russolo here, Bala's Dog on a Leash here, and to materialize the forces of the invisible and to give visible form to speed and dynamism. Marey is on the top and Bala, 1913, on the bottom. So I want to conclude now by pointing to the link that joins all of these aspects of Marey's work and Marey's work to Burney. So Marey's work, his subject, and which was movement, and his method of mechanical decomposition is at once the beginning of a new synthesis of science and art, and the focal point of labor and art, and the dissolution of the space-time continuum. It signals the convergence of the new concept of the working body with the crisis of time and space perception. His work, I think, marks the place where social and cultural modernity intersect. Thank you.
Yeah, I thought maybe
you want to switch back?
Well, yeah, I'll switch back. Maybe let me put it on play. So I was, Marta was ending here on futurism, and there's this other interesting connection. Oops, there was that was interesting too. Check this out, the little analog. Oh, I can't get it. It's too fast for me now. Well, anyway, for a moment, I don't know, did you see that breakup because of the analog switch, you know, trying to work the digital information? Anyway, you know, I actually started making sculpture because of the futurists, although I had no idea that the futurists were in any way connected to Marey's work. So, you know, this is a Boccioni piece, The Development of a Bottle in Space. In 1970, when I was a grad student in psychology, I started playing with some clay, and anyway, maybe I'll get to that in a second. But you know, this is a bronze model of one of Marey's studies of the birds in motion, and you can see the different phases of the motion of the bird as it's flying, and a very Marey-like sculpture by Boccioni, the 1913 Unique Forms of Continuity in Space. And this was the piece that got me to want to make sculpture while I'm studying psychology in grad school. You know, wow. Anyway, I'm looking at this, reading my text here and thinking, what the hell was I thinking about? Sorry, I don't know what I was thinking about. I'm looking at this, I was going to read it, but I don't know what I'm talking about here.
Well, because you're talking about modernity. You're
I was talking about
where I started,
yeah.
and
that's
the
true.
promise
yeah,
of progress,
yeah.
scientific progress, artistic progress, and you're wondering.
Very embarrassing. Anyway, thank you.
I'm reading your notes.
Yeah,
okay.
That's good. Well, at least you understood what I was talking about.
Absolutely. Modernity.
Modernity, yeah. So in a way, there is this falseness and exploitation about science and modernity and technological change. You know, it promises this kind of scientific salvation. And it seemed to me also to be the best hope for a solution to any problem. And yet, you know, at the same time, there was not that which was inspiring me about this work, even though this work is referring to that. You know, after seeing this, I made this. You know, I'm going to show you this is the first sculpture well, the second sculpture, I made one when I was about 10 years old. But this is the second sculpture I ever made. You can see this is like, there's no question this is, you know, that I'm looking at Baccioni's work and I'm thinking, you know, I can do this, you know. But it wasn't just that I could do it, it was just that I wanted to do it, you know. And the interesting thing was that I thought of myself at the time, this is pre-Spock from Star Trek, but I thought of myself at the time as being this person. I'm about 20 years old, 21 years old. I'm thinking, well, I don't need emotions. I've evolved beyond emotions. You know, I'm a rational being. It's all reason, you know, just like this scientific idea, you know, that we were talking about here, this idea of understanding everything through science. But, you know, so emotions just get in the way, and they're nasty and messy, and they're clearly, you know, I clearly don't have them. And then I make something like this, and I had this revelation. I said, oh my God, I do have emotions, because this thing is out there grasping at something, you know. And you know, I'm thinking, you know, I don't do that, do I? You know, I don't, you know. And but I had to recognize that not only did I have the emotions, but here's another view of it. But not only do I have these emotions, but I also probably have been studying psychology to understand myself, and it was not working, clearly, because all the psychology was doing was getting me to think of the world as being something I could understand through some theoretical construct. But in fact, there was something else there that I was missing, and Baccioni had kind of opened this possibility up to me. So I began making these you know, these art pieces. You know, I thought you were getting a picture of my hat, which is good, you know. You know, anyways, I just told this story that I now have up on the screen, but anyway, you know, it was a revelation, and the connections kind of abound with Marey. This is one of a series of Marey's wind tunnel experiments, and one of my early pieces, not quite as early as the ones you just saw, was also this piece, which I called the Aerodynamics of Sleep. You know.
Good.
And you know, so even in something like this, I'm kind of metaphorizing the same kind of approach. You know, taking this scientific universe and trying to find a way to make it work for me to understand things, but to understand things in a somewhat different way than the scientific understanding. And this is not really totally relevant, but this was my first maybe mildly interactive piece. This is 1970. That last one was 73. And this is a little baby you could cradle in your arms, you know, and hold, you know. And that was my intention, was that you should pick this up and carry it on your arm, you know. And it's a very smooth, fiberglassy kind of thing, done in the year of my daughter's birth, you know. So it was, you know, it had these other connections. Anyway, I think that was my little digression that was based on following up on the futurists and how they had kind of helped to get me into art. And I had no idea that Marey, I'd never heard of Marey at that point, you know. It was, of course, I'd seen Marey there's a fabulous book, Simon Gideon, I think. What is the name of the book?
Mechanization
Takes Command, yes. And it's a fabulous book, really interesting, where in one part he connects Marey's automatic camera to the machine gun. You know, because they were both roughly at the inventions of roughly the same period, you know. And it's a book like that. He makes those kind of connections all through a huge volume. It's out of print, but I heartily recommend it. And but I'd seen Marey's work in that, but I had kind of forgotten about it. And then I had my little visit to the Bakken Museum in Minneapolis, and Heart Trouble, and Marta's book, and
that was it.
Here we are.
And here we are.
Just before we dive
please,
too deep, I'm trying to kind of sense the atmosphere in the room and see.
And what are you feeling?
Oh, well, I tell you after the announcement.
Okay.
Trying to sense if you have any kind of comments or questions to jump in. you can do this at any time.
Yeah.
I'm just sort of, checking around
I
every
think
now
that
and
would be a good idea to hear.
checking around.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
please,
so that's
yeah.
the first one already. But can you hold on for 1 second?
Oh, you have to
hold on?
wait till.
We have to,
Yeah.
I give you mine, but you have a second one?
Yeah, there's a it sort of loops from science to art, right? So we start with the machines of Marey, taking pulse and making images out of movement, so they become like diagrams, and then diagrams start to inform art and futurism and inform your early sculptures, and then you move back almost. Like
Yes,
you move from the form of time or back to the machines, and I would like to hear what the perception of both is. So if you see like these forms, right, that relate to time, how that relates to like how you participate in the pieces as machines. Is there a switch from one art form to another?
Well, whatever images I have of the switch are not here, but there. It wasn't a simple, smooth thing, I don't think, although there are a few pieces on the wall here from early 1980s, that were, that were little wall machines that people could play with, little games that people can play with. I think part of it was that I was having these experiences where I'd make something, and in the course of making something, I would have this almost religious moment where suddenly, I would understand the universe, this much of it, just this tiniest little bit for just a millisecond. But I was getting this experience that was kind of an amazing experience, and I started to think gradually that I wanted to somehow get a flavor of that moment into the artwork in a way that wasn't just there in the piece for you to behold, but was there for you to have for yourself. That you could somehow get that moment, perhaps, a moment of discovery, a moment of revelation of, just in a tiny way.
So the moment when you see that baby hanging on the wall and you want to pick it up, and you call it interactive, which is really stunning. You call it interactive. Is that the same that makes us pick up the handles and explore? Is that a sort of similar?
I think it's the continuation of that very gesture. Yeah. Yeah, so I'll bring the baby back up because she's so close. Yeah, I think it's a continuation of that same gesture, except that I realized that I at that point I had the baby on a baby blanket, but that was the closest I had come to creating a way to suggest that you should pick her up, and I think at this point now I have these points that are pretty clearly say, crank yourself into me, and for the coffin back here, or wind me up for this clock, or turn my handle, I don't have a label telling you to do this, but the red handle, I think, speaks volumes, Isn't it
also a question of how the machines around us invite us to interact or participate, and doesn't that have something to do with their fragility?
Well, here it's sort of the abstract form that it's like a tracing of movements or touchings, and that's a clear sign, touch me.
Yeah.
So though it seems like extremely determined, like on a motorcycle you do, but of course it's not. It's still explorative, and you still need to stroke it and use it, and something else happens which is not really predictable in a way.
Yeah, well, because they're not accustomed experiences, I think, so I'm taking a common interface, riding a bicycle. I don't know how common cranking yourself into a coffin is, but turning a handle, riding a bicycle, sitting on a stool, these are all things that you would do, but then I'm giving you a different experience with that than you would normally have, and I think, yes, I think the fragility is part of it, because there's an object, a very fragile object here that you're looking at, and you're being invited to touch it, and yet you're not sure unless you've been drinking a lot, you're not sure whether how hard you should touch it, you know. And if you're drinking a lot, then you don't care how hard you should touch it. But you know, if you're interacting with it and you're sober, you think, well, you know. And I like this because it makes the objects, even though they're very mechanical things, it makes them almost organic, you know, because they have this. They're sort of hovering at this moment between breaking and not breaking. And so as you're working it, you're trying to keep it going. You're trying to keep it alive, I think. I mean, I hope that people have this experience. And so you're trying to help make something happen, and your investment increases, and you're also feeling like there's an interaction going on between you and the machine, that you're somehow keeping it alive, making it come alive, keeping it alive. And of course, this is something I work towards now. At the beginning, it was because I didn't know what I was doing, and the pieces were always fragile because I didn't know how to make them better. Now I try to make them fragile, and sometimes it's hard. Although we just had another piece break overnight, so you know, I'm still working on this line here. Yeah.
Okay,
I was wondering, I didn't see everything yet, but some of the machines, like the input is kind of the same with the output. Like when you sit in the chair and you wiggle the output with the cheeks, it's like a bit feels for me like the input versus the output is the same. But then the other one there, where you have to move a lot, bicycle a lot, and then there's a small knitting at the end.
Yeah, yeah.
Where you like, it feels like this big machine with a lot of input gives this small output. But I was wondering if you were playing with these different kinds of.
Yes, but not quite as consciously as as that. But yes, no, I definitely. And you know, I mean, of course, for me, the slowing down of everything was part of an idea that I had that no single person, no single group, because that takes more than one person to work. Someone has to be sitting on the couch doing nothing for the pedaling on the bikes to amount to any knitting. And so I wanted to slow that down, so that even though it took more than one person even at one instant, it also took many groups of people over a long period of time for there to be any appreciable knitting starting to occur. But it also does separate you in a way from the product, and this one is a very direct connection, as you were saying. This one, I mean, as soon as you saw that stool in the earlier video being used to just measure how people are leaning, and then I wanted to make some other kind of interface, some way to have people interact, and I thought, oh, a headset. I haven't done anything with a headset, and you know, so I made a set of latex earphones, and then but because for me everything needs to have errors in it. There have to be mistakes, or I never get anywhere. So I made these latex earphones, but I made the headset too big, so they fell down onto my cheeks. And at that instant, I heard, you know, the Irving Berlin song, you know, Fred Astaire singing, "When we're out together dancing cheek to cheek," you know, and immediately I hooked them up to the stool, where these are cheeks in English also, and so the lower cheeks would pump air against your upper cheeks, and you can dance with yourself cheek to cheek. So all of that was clear instantly as soon as these things fell onto my cheeks by accident. And you know, and then, you know, the title, the connection to the stool, you know, everything became clear. So even though, you know, and afterwards I can think about things the way you were describing them. But when I'm making them, it's more like this. It's more like you know, like I'm just frustrated, I'm doing something, and then accident happens, and the accident is good. Sometimes the accidents are bad. And you know, this break that we have right now, that's not a good one. We tested it to see if it would be a good one, but it actually is deadening the sound, and you know, we're gonna have to fix it. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks for the question. Yeah.
Okay.
Well,
yeah, well, maybe we can kind of save the more practical questions to our little tour in the end.
Yeah, please. Yeah.
And more get into get our theory straight for the moment, and then we do the practical tour and break it up later on, and then you're most welcome to to go along the tour and come up with other questions in that regard. So I'm just, what I was initially going to say, just trying to send some questions that come into your conversation. So if you have any, you just sort of do something like this. And but
he's got one.
But you haven't even started yet, and you have already questions. But no, we take these.
I wanted to ask if you would talk a bit about the Coffin Piece and how it came to be.
Okay, was that going to fit with one of your questions?
Absolutely.
Well, first let me find, I have some images of this I have to find. So we have a nice gray screen up there, and I will look for this, and hopefully it won't take too long.
Or the MRI piece, whichever.
No, I can only start on one thing at a time. Actually, this image I'm about to bring up is related, because it was a part of a revelation that came on the same trip I took. This is some of the waxworks from either Bologna or Florence, some of these wax models of the body that were 18th century models that are quite both gruesome and fascinating. And this one is especially disturbing, I find, because it's so sexy, and yet it is so horrible. Anyway, that's a digression. I just came across them. Let me go back. Sorry, you should never ask me a question. Ask me no questions. It's obviously way down in here, because I didn't think we were going to get to this at all, but and I've also managed to separate some of the images to make it really difficult. So let's some of them are way up here. Where? This is fun, isn't it? I'm going to plunge right into the middle of it because I can't find the beginning. This is the problem of having a 12-inch laptop. You know, the little thumbnails on the side are so small that I can't see anything. But the Coffin Piece is a piece. I started this piece, and in a way, you can maybe my first slide I was going to show you is about the horns and the springs, so you could look at the slide as it were right here. And the horns and the springs. I was thinking of a model of the brain. And I thought I could make a tin can telephone model of the brain. These are really tin can telephones. You know, we have paper cups or tin cans with a string between them, and you're saying, "I can't hear you." That's what you're mostly saying. Pull the string tighter. And you're kind of doing this. So this is my kind of model of the brain. I think it kind of has this synaptic look to it, but at the time I was working on this, my mother's health was failing. I'm talking to her on the telephone. I'm thinking about how fabulous the telephone is. My mother could be dead. I could be speaking to her on the telephone. I wouldn't really know, because the telephone is kind of magic. I don't actually feel the person I'm speaking to. I just assume that because she's saying something, she can't be dead, but I don't know. Maybe she could be. And so I'm doing this, and at the same, and then I went to my mother when she was actually dying, and was with her when she died, and then I had to take a break. I thought I had to do something about death involved with the brain somehow in terms of this piece, but I didn't know what it was going to be. And I went Marty and I went on a trip to Europe, and Isabella, who's sitting next to Marty, took us to one of her favorite churches in Bologna, Santo Stefano. And I can say more about the church, but I've got a few images of the interior. And it's a very claustrophobic little church. And you have to go on this little journey into the church until you finally get to this spot where you can see where the bones of the saint are, but you can't get to where the saint is because the saint, you've been blocked from this. And I had this revelation that, you know, to me, other people have undoubtedly thought of this before, but I thought, this is installation art. You know, you've come a certain distance, you've come to this place, you've made a journey, you're there, you're a pilgrimage, if you will, but you're there, you know, at this spot. You can only experience this particular piece of art if you're there. You can look at pictures of it, but it's not going to do the same thing. You have to be there. And in the same way, you have to be at an installation piece. And yet here we come all this distance, we come, you know, right next to where the saint is, but we can't get to the saint. And and just like in installation art, there's a message, there's some information that's being imparted here. You know, the designers of the church are telling us that we can't get to the saint because the saint is living in a different universe than the one we're in. The saint is not only a saint and you're not. I'm a saint and you're not. But also the saint is dead and you're not. You know, and no matter how much distance you traverse, you can't traverse that distance of death and still be alive. You know, so that very idea made me want to make a coffin that would allow you to crank yourself into it and come back out, but also be able to speak to people over tin can telephones on the outside, you know. So, you know, and still not be able to understand a word anyone is saying. So it seemed altogether perfect, you know, to me. So anyway, so this is how the coffin piece connects.
What is the coffin piece's name?
Oh yes, the name. Yeah, well, names for me come from myriad sources. So like Cheek to Cheek, as you heard, came from the Irving Berlin song.
But you have some very interesting names. The
yeah.
Belief would be a brother, which is over there, and the Theory of Entanglement and the Etiology of Innocence. So how do you come to these names?
Well, I give you first the coffin piece, which is, you know, it's ... You know, so the what did they call that? Ellipsis, and then you know, and the synapse sweetly singing. So I'm making a reference to the brain with the synapse, but the actual line is kind of a bastardization of an old Cream song. Cream being a rock and roll group from the late 60s, early 70s, and they had a song, The Tales of Brave Ulysses, how his naked ears were tortured by the sirens sweetly singing. And of course they had like Ginger Baker slamming on the drums at that moment, so I can't do that for you here. So, so I'm thinking of the I was trying to make an allusion to the brain and this end to death, because I think, you know, there it's kind of a Freudian thing almost, that, you know, that creativity and thinking and death are all kind of interconnected in our minds, because our minds are kind of trying to work out the fact that we're going to die somehow, even though it's not consciously there. I don't know if I believe this or not, but it's an interesting idea. And it's also kind of like that thing, you know, about the saints, about this kind of elusive quality. And I think the sirens, you know, the sirens for Ulysses were also a figment of his mind. I mean, it's really, I think, you know, I think it's kind of this thing, you know, this sort of self-absorption, you know, of ourselves within our minds, you know, that we get this sense of you know, that there's this song out there, you know, that we are drawn to irresistibly, and it's really just us. It's our brains working, you know. And I think Isabella took me on a tour of her lab, and we were listening to the synapses clicking away, you know, through some electrical transposition, you know, and it was another one of these things. I'm thinking, oh, so this is what I sound like when I'm off. You know, so which apparently doesn't happen too often. But yeah, so other pieces, other title. Well, Belief Would Be a Brother is this piece is really very much a copy of a Marey apparatus, which Marta showed you in that connection. I probably have a picture here somewhere, but if I look for it, I won't be able to talk. And it's you know, it's an apparatus. He was trying to simulate the flight of a bird or an insect, and trying to see if he could actually make something that would move with simply by putting 2 feathers on this pneumatic pumping machine. You know, so I've got a pneumatic pumping machine without the feathers, but it does
Fly.
It does sort of fly. It kind of bounces and attempts to get off the ground. So this is truly was done as an homage to Marey, and so I wanted somehow the title to honor him in some way. And I'm thinking, okay, so he, you know, Marey is a hero of mine in a sense, and at that moment I'm thinking of this Wallace Stevens poem. I'm thinking of The Man with the Blue Guitar, where it's a very long poem. I don't think one of his best, although one of his most famous. And it does have some fabulous lines in it, like, paint us a picture beyond us yet ourselves, something exactly as we are. And I'm not doing that well, am I? But anyway, but it's something like that. But at one point, he's also talking about air. I mean, the associations in one's mind, if you track them down, it's really nuts. Anyway, I'm thinking air somehow is crossing my mind in the course of all this. And Stevens is talking about air. He has this little interlude where he says, "Good air, good friend," you know, and then he says, yeah, "Belief would be a brother, belief would be a friend." And I'm thinking, well, you know, so I'm thinking, well, I'd like to have this sense of connection to Marey, you know, this sense of friendship through the air, if you will. Mm-hmm. So that was, you know, you would never know that reading the title. There would be no way you could possibly come up with that, but nevertheless, it seemed to feel right.
And the Etiology of Innocence?
Ah, well, this is also very connected to Marey, because it's because when I look at, let me find this image again, because this is worth going back to. When I find Marey, this is up at the beginning, which is good, because I don't have to go all the way to the end to find this. But not that beginning. Not that beginning. Well, I have one image I don't know that you have here. Well, here, actually, just as another aside, this is an image of, and then we'll get back to the question. Sorry. I hit play this way. This is a book about the brain. This is an image from a book about the brain by Gerald Edelman, and he makes this analogy that the brain is like a network of springs. And I came across this, I am happy to say, after I had my network of springs already made up. I'm thinking, yes. You know, I have no idea exactly what he's talking about in this, except that you, with springs, you get a kind of a resonant memory, you know, which is different than, you know, it's a very analog kind of thing, you know, and to simulate the way a spring works digitally, you can't really do that. And I think that Edelman is partially arguing for this kind of meaty quality to the brain, although I'm not sure because I didn't really understand his book. Anyway, back to my search here for the image I was looking for. Here it is. Right nearby, as it turns out. So this image of Marey's really, which is the beginning of this heart piece, it really sums up. I think this interesting connection, because on the right side you have all this industrial apparatus, you know, this somewhat sophisticated, you know, mechanism to activate this thing, and on the left side, on the board, strapped to the board, you've got these uncertain organs, you know. I mean, what is the significant part of this? Marey wasn't sure. What was significant about heart action? Was the shape of the aorta particularly important? Was the shape of the ventricle and the auricle? Were these things important? So he's kind of trying to maintain organic shapes here. And there's a certain innocence in that gesture, you know. And so the title of the piece, you know, the word etiology is a word, it's an English word that really is in the medical profession. It's about the origins of a disease. You know, when we talked about the title of the show, I had suggested Etiology of Innocence, and everyone at V2 said etiology means nothing. in Holland. No one will understand what you're talking about. So we should do something else. I said, okay, Origins. But etiology has so much more in it because the etiology, first of all, I'm suggesting that innocence is frequently thought of as a disease, you know, by posing it this way, by saying etiology of innocence. And I'm also alluding to my own medical history, you know, that I guess when I hit my chest, it makes noises, right? Yeah, not a good idea. My heart, you know. Anyway, we can work it. So so I'm alluding to, you know, my own medical history with the word etiology as well. And I'm also thinking about this moment in time when Marey was working, where it was really kind of, you know, he started with this almost innocent gesture to try and understand these things mechanically, and in a way, from looking at images like this, you think that he starts thinking that the explanation is going to be simple. It's going to be clear. It's not going to be that difficult. And then you see that the apparatus at the back is already getting to be much more complicated than he probably originally intended. You can see these things look like they've evolved. They've become more complex. And, you know, so I think that there's this interesting connection between the way the world works. In fact, I think, do I have it above? No, I have it below. This is the piece. This is a later Marey circulatory model. And you can see this image has nothing organic looking in it. There's nothing simple. This is a sophisticated model of the circulatory system. You know, Marey has already discovered that this quick idea that he had that the shape of things was going to be critical was not so critical. The volumes were critical. The timing was critical. So he's got another apparatus here now that it looks totally mechanized. That's also being a heart. You know,
but Marey believed that the body was a machine. I don't think you do.
Well,
I don't think that.
I think I believe the body is a machine, but I think it's a broken machine.
And a fragile one?
Yeah, I think machines. I think because this idea of the body as a machine is, you know, people think of if you think of the body as a machine, you think it's an ideal machine, but in the world there are no ideal machines.
I think he was just. He could be all reduced to mechanics.
Well, I mean, I'm alive because of some of that reductionism. You know, I mean, they replaced a piece of plumbing, you know, and you know, and saved my life, you know, because the plumbing the pipe was about to burst. They put a piece of Dacron hose in there instead, and you know, it's now how many years later? 14 years later.
And it's still working.
Knock on wood. This is why I work in wood, by the way. I get to knock on wood, which is an English expression for keeping good luck. Knock on wood, you know. So, yeah.
Also, that there is emotion. There is more than a machine and everything. So you find out emotion in your job. So where is the emotion in this?
Well, I think I'm hoping. Well, first of all, this is I think, you know, as we were talking before, the fragility, I think, of my machines are fragile enough that I think that your heart goes out to them, so you start to get an emotional attachment to them, even though they're machines, and then you're playing with them, so you're starting to feel things. You're starting to feel yourself feeling a connection to this machine. You're starting to wonder at what it's doing and listen to the noises, and they're evoking associations, and emotions are starting to come up, I'm hoping. And you know, so I'm thinking that you know, in a way I'm trying to create this machine acts as a device to provoke something in you, but not necessarily to tell you what you're going to feel. Although, you know, there are some, you know, I'm obviously contriving as much as I can here, and so I'm hoping that you'll feel emotions, and that you'll be the conduit, and that you know, of the emotional part of the piece, and you know, so even the piece, the theory of entanglement downstairs, where you know, people are gradually making this knitting happen. It's all very mechanized, and yet, when I was making the piece, and I wanted there to be this part where someone was doing nothing, and that was important for someone sitting on the couch doing nothing, that would be important for the piece to work. And this friend of mine came over and said, what you have here is a metaphor for capitalism. There's someone doing nothing, and that's what makes everything happen. And so I hadn't thought about that, but I added a label. It says that when you're doing nothing, you're engaged in you are the capital, and then the labor also has a label, and the craft has a label, and what's been happening, especially here at V2, for some reason, people are starting to play the roles of the capitalists and the labor. You know, they're starting to argue about, you know, union rules. Why should I keep working like this? We're just sitting there. No, keep working. You must keep working. You know, I need to see what you're doing. You know, and so there's this other little, you know, connection to, you know, to aspects of daily life that I had never been part of the original piece, but crept into it, and now they have this emotional impact, even though that piece is actually a colder piece in many ways than many of the others. Although it's about knitting, which is a very, you know, kind of home body kind of event. Anyway, I don't know. The emotions creep in through my associations, I guess. Yeah.
Which is the way to intuition.
Oh, intuition, yeah. You have to use the mic because I can't.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, so it's an intuitive kind of thing, I guess, but I kind of trust that if I'm making a machine, it'll come out differently because I'm making it. and that somehow something else that's going on inside me is going to infect it. And I guess, you know, knock on wood again, I feel like I've been lucky so far, you know.
It also suggests intimacy, theory of entanglement,
Yeah,
conservation of intimacy.
Yeah.
So you have the intimacies of the body and the machine and the bodies with other bodies. That seems to be a strong...
Yeah, and I'm very interested in this, in having people have to connect in some way to work the pieces.
Not just to the machines, but to each other.
To each other, exactly. That they, I mean, in this piece, it's in the Etiology of Innocence, it's relatively crude, you know, the connection that is. You know, one person is cranking this, and they can't see what they're doing. I mean, they can see the organs working, but they can't see anything else that they're having an effect on. You know, the heartbeat on the other side of the wall, the organs throbbing over there, and yet, you know, so what people do is that they hopefully will find another person to help them. And they'll say, okay, I'll crank this. I know there's something going on over there. I'll crank this for you, but, you know, maybe you can crank it for me. You know, I'll do it for you if you do it for me. So it's, you know, it's, you know, there's a certain little elemental reciprocity starts to build up, and people start to form conversations and interact about it. And, oh, look, this is connected here too. Okay, let's do that again. And then maybe a larger group starts to form, I'm hoping. And, you know, and then with the, you know, the synapse piece, I'm hoping for these conversations to be happening inside and outside the coffins. And then downstairs, I'm really applying my technology to studying a couple sitting together on the bench, and if the way they move is actually being written on the wall and indicated by these balls moving. And if they're working with each other, well, if it's one person, you can make things work. But if with two people, things work better. And with two people who are working with each other, they work better yet.
Okay. Well, I guess we can take maybe one or two more questions before we further informalize our gathering.
Yeah.
So let me just check. There were
Thank you,
some
Marta.
before. I think, yeah. Maybe I have one too, and that is you've been elaborating on your, you know, connections, connectedness to Marey and his work. And, you know, I sometimes think, of course, it's totally fictitious what Marey would have, you know, like if you had a conversation or, you know, like a meeting in your studio. It's just, you know, sometimes I wonder, you know, because you say you're taking, you know, you're taking from the images, from the ideas, from the theory. And maybe that's also a question to Marta, who has, you know, been like really getting into the work of Marey, and you know, like what would be the cross, you know, fictitious cross connection, Marey going through the exhibition of Bernie today? That's a bit of a weird question.
That's a very interesting question. Marey was, as I hoped I showed through the trajectory of changing the subject and the machine and the subject and the machine and the camera and then the film, and he was always working towards an increased, a finer and finer way of analyzing movement out there, whereas I think that he would find Bernie's machines
out of date.
Backward, out of date.
Interesting.
Dealing with things that he would have immediately, I think, gone up and tried to fix it, don't you?
I do. Also, I actually know, in a sense, what Marey would say, because I had a conversation with a proxy of Marey, in a sense. I told you I discovered this work at the Bakken Institute, and the curator there had kindly taken me around and shown me all this stuff, and I'd gotten so excited that he gave me booklets and, and took me into the vault, and I got to see the actual piece of glass that Miller and Urey had used to create the amino acids with lightning, and it was like, and so I thought, after I had done all this work, I thought I would send the video back to Albert, and he would be interested to see what I had done with, based on this work, and he said, well, I watched your video, but I prefer the real thing.
Oh. But there's really no comparison. I mean, Marey becomes more detached, and the whole beauty of Bernie's work is the involvement and the intimacy that you have, as we talked about, with the machines. Marey is moving away from think of a camera. He doesn't even need his tubing anymore. He's got light.
Yeah, touch becomes irrelevant.
Touch becomes totally irrelevant to him, and it's everything to Bernie.
Yeah, so it's, not much.
That's what he would say.
I think so,
Okay, well, that's good to know.
I'm channeling him.
Over here.
I have a question, and I hope I can explain myself well. I happened to see this Hollywood movie yesterday. It was about a guy who teaches physics and math, and he basically believes that the world is rational and everything can be calculated, but then his wife dies, and he finds a string of numbers that predict the future, and then the movie goes on, and he starts doubting, like, is my belief this solid, or is there some order in the world? And I wonder, by your accidents in finding names and you're knocking the table, your work starts kind of practical, but do you have a conclusion about your opinion about reality in this order?
Well, I like to hedge my bets. And let's see if I can find these. Well, you'll see these things. There are a couple, there's one right behind you. I've got these little boxes in the show that say just in case on them. And inside the boxes, here's one. It says just in case, and this is an expression in English, right, for just in case something happens. Just in case something were to go wrong, you see, I've got an out of order sign. I've got 4 of these in the exhibit, which is a very magical gesture. I mean, it's sort of like, invoking invoking gods I don't believe in, and yet, sort of reminding them that I'm ready, so maybe they won't bother to make things break, because because of course everything is about messing with me. Why would they bother if they know I'm ready for them? They do anyway. They ignore me completely, and whoever they are. But I still keep the out of order signs there because they have some practical use. And I think that this is, and this also, I've got this little story with this as well, because Niels Bohr, one of the founders of quantum mechanics, and quantum mechanics is this terribly mysterious universe, really, that it proposes. It proposes really a breakdown in our whole notion of causality at a microscopic level. At a larger level, causality still works, but at a microscopic level, you have a theory of entanglement, for one thing. that where particles can be entangled and they can affect each other without having any way of doing that. They just are entangled, and therefore they will always respond together in some way. But Niels Bohr apparently had a horseshoe over the door to his office. And his colleagues would say, Niels, you're a scientist. You don't believe in this magic stuff, do you? And he said, no, of course I don't believe it. But they say it works whether you believe it or not.
Good.
So this is the way I feel.
I think that's actually a pretty good way to conclude. And it says temporarily out of order.
Yeah.
So
Yes.
working on our temporality just now. And we further informalize, I suggest, the situation. So you can keep on asking questions, but we just sort of move around close to the coffee table. There's still coffee and some food over there, and you're welcome to help yourself there. And so we also move around the space. Bernie, Marta are still here and around, and we just sort of break it up at this stage. Now, thank you very much for your presentations and your talk here, Bernie, and especially Marta. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.